Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. The Great Recession officially ended more than 5 years ago, and yet we're still mired in a lousy economy with insufficient job growth. The people getting the raw end of the stick are America's ordinary working men and women. Too many of the jobs that are being created are low wage, part-time, temporary, and very few offer a decent benefits package. We'll talk about this with my guest, Joshua Freeman, a professor at Queens College and CUNY's Murphy Institute for Worker Education and Labor Studies. Welcome. Thanks for coming in. I appreciate it. So we recently got the news of yet another disappointing jobs report. Very few jobs created, even fewer good jobs. How is it that American workers are still in this funk more than 5 years after the recession supposedly ended?
Right. Well, you know, the numbers are really pretty bad because, you know, we're talking about over a 6% unemployment rate, but equally important, we see a big decline in what they call labor force participation rate. You know, fewer and fewer Americans are even trying to get a job, you know, if they're out of work. So I think it's a serious situation, and I think what we've seen is a recovery based on finance, ironically, you know, based on the same industry that got us into trouble in the first place, without the kind of job creation that has accompanied previous economic recoveries. So it's been a very weak recovery from the point of working people. In fact, a weak recovery for everyone except people at the very top.
Right. So that monthly job number, I mean, you just mentioned, it doesn't really tell you about the people who have dropped out of the labor force. It also doesn't tell you much about the quality of the jobs that are being created. So you get a raw number. Right. But can you talk about that a little bit? Talk about the wages, talk about job conditions.
Sure, absolutely. You know, I think what we've seen here in New York and to some extent in the whole country is that the jobs that have been created, and in fact, New York now has more jobs than before the recession. So there have been jobs created. These are not really replacements. You know, the jobs that were lost were more skilled, higher paid, more stable jobs than the jobs that have come in to replace them. And mostly we've seen in the job growth in the post-recession years, really low wage, you know, just above minimum, low benefit types of jobs. The result is, astoundingly enough, you know, if you look at income of individuals in the last few years, only the top 20% of earners have seen their income go up. The other 80% have seen their income go down. And to have this happen during what's supposed to be a recovery, you know, is really a sign that we don't have an economy that's working for most people.
Exactly. And a lot of those jobs are part-time. They're contingent.
Right.
Very few, as you mentioned, have benefits. It's almost as if a lot of American workers, especially younger workers, don't realize that this has not been the norm for most of the time since World War II. How do your students, the younger folks, look at this, and what do you tell them about that?
Well, you know, they're anxious. You know, they have a kind of level of anxiety about their personal futures, which is completely different from what my cohort had, and even what you saw maybe 15 or 20 years ago. They're extraordinarily hardworking, in part out of fear, you know, and that sometimes pushes them into very limited kinds of choices, you know, in terms of the occupations they want to pursue. So, yeah, certainly one tries to talk about this historically. You know, for example, what's a acceptable or normal unemployment rate? Right. You know, in the 50s and 60s, you know, 3%. That was considered, you know, okay, 4%. Okay, anything above 4%, you had a real problem. We're normalized to think at 5, 6. In New York, we're close to 8%. No one thinks New York is in a crisis. We're close to 8% unemployment. So I think here's where history can be helpful, you know, in talking to young people today and trying to contextualize what they're living through. You know, I grew up in an era where every year looked better than the year before, and I didn't go to college worried about, you know, I worried I was going to have a dull job, you know, I was going to be a white-collar, you know, drone, you know. People now would love to be a white-collar drone, you know. So I think talking about the past is extraordinarily useful to say it hasn't always been this way, which implies that it doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't necessarily tell you what we should do next.
Right. So one of the things that's been a real problem in terms of job creation or job destruction really has been the phenomenal technological advances that we've seen, well, for a few decades now, actually. And it used to be that you'd get these technology improvements. They would kill some jobs, but they'd ultimately create more jobs than they destroyed. That may not be the case anymore. Is that correct?
Well, it is. I think it's a very, very hard thing to measure. And, I'm not an economist, and economists themselves disagree about that. But I think what is clear is that the productivity gains that come from introducing all these new technological developments are not being shared in the way they once were. It used to be that the average income of workers pretty much tracked the increase in productivity. So, if a company introduced new techniques or people just worked harder and they were producing more product per hour of work, some of that gain went to workers in terms of higher pay, some of it went to owners in terms of stock, dividends or whatever it might be. You don't see that today. Almost all the gains in productivity are going to the wealthy. So we have multiple problems here. You have increased productivity, which may be reducing the number of jobs. Certainly within specific industries it is. I mean, it also does create some new jobs,
right.
And the gains, the enormous gains that come from that, are not being distributed. So we have the irony of the juxtaposition of ever more sophisticated technology and enormous accomplishments and impoverishment, growing poverty levels. So it's really almost a return to the 19th century, when Henry George was writing about
Right.
poverty and progress. Well, that's our lives,
Well, that's a pretty dramatic shift that you're describing,
Yeah.
though. I mean, this transition from shared productivity
Yeah.
gains to a situation where we've now normalized the fact that virtually all the gains go to the top. How did that occur, and why was not more made of it?
Well, it's not a simple thing, but I think that there are some key factors here. One is really power, shifts in power, and I think you see that at the workplace itself with the decline of the union movement over the last 40 years or so, and also in government, where you have more and more policy, regulation, tax approaches favoring a relatively small group versus the whole society. And I think it's not happened all at once. To me, the key years were the late 70s and the 1980s when the United States, and in fact the whole industrial world, went through a really deep recession. I think we came out of that recession on a different basis, and that's been kind of playing itself out ever since. And I think that results in a lot of what you're talking about.
The decline in union membership and the decline in labor clout has been dramatic. It's been over a long period of time, but
Yeah.
it's still dramatic. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, it's tremendous, and in the New York state region, we feel that much less than the rest of the country. But it used to be that about 1/3 of all American workers carried a union card, and the template companies, the GMs, the U.S. Steels, the Ford Motor Company, they were all union. Today we are down to 11% of the workforce, and that's not really a comparable figure, because if you're looking just at the private sector, it's less than 7%. And what are the template companies today? It's Walmart, Amazon, Google, totally non-union. Totally non-union. So it's a really different landscape. How it happened? I think there are multiple things. One is shifts in the economy, as heavily unionized sectors like manufacturing declined, and other sectors which never were very unionized grew. That affected it. Some of it's a regional shift. The shift in the center of American industry and population to the South and the Southwest moves people out of heavily unionized areas, into less unionized. But a lot of it is also a successful offensive by business to deunionize. And I think that really started in the 70s. It was part of their response to problems that they faced. They had real problems, don't get me wrong, declining profits, worldwide recession. And they really set out to check the power of unions by fighting them in strikes, by moving plants to other parts of the country, to making sure that legislation was not passed that was more favorable to unions. So I think all these things have converged, and it's a hard spiral to reverse. If you grow up in much of this country, you have no familiarity with the union. It's just, it's from out of space. A lot of this country in 1930, 40, 50, 60, you saw a picket line, you would never cross it. It was a moral stain on your family forever, you know. Now, people, you know, they have no basis for even understanding that. You know, again, New York and some other parts are a bit of an exception, but in most of the country, that's now become the case.
Now, it's one thing not to understand what the history has been in terms of unions or the importance of unions or whatever. It's quite another to be hostile to unions. And I've noticed as I've crossed the country over the past few years that a lot of ordinary people are really hostile to the very idea of labor unions. Do you know what that's based upon? Do you have an idea?
Well, I think one piece of it is a kind of resentment that often, you know, union members are getting benefits that those people themselves aren't getting. And I think you see this the most extreme in the case of public employees. You know, you have a worker who's struggling, they're making $30,000 a year, they're not getting any health benefits or pension benefits, they're paying taxes to support someone who's you know, getting all that, and it kind of ticks them off. That said, the higher up you go on the income scale, the more likely you're going to get the anti-union resentment. Right. So maybe my $30,000 example would be better, the $130,000. So some of it's a kind of resentment. Unions maybe have fed a little bit of this. You know, they're often seen as special interest. You know, they're seen as fighting very hard for their own members, but not necessarily for the broader issues. You know, you see this intensely in the fights about teacher unionism. The critics say they don't care about the kids. You know, I don't think that's really true, but you know, people are making the case. So I think that's part of it. You know, and of course some of it maybe goes back to the kind of individualism, the entrepreneurial, you know, kind of ideology that's pretty central to the U.S. I wouldn't make too much of that, though. You know, when you poll people at work, a lot of people who are not in unions say they would like to be in a union.
Right. And we actually see this with the protests, the demonstrations, the walkouts of low-wage workers, which has really spread. You know, I don't know how to characterize exactly how big it is yet, but it has been growing. Talk about that a little bit, and talk about the direction they may be moving in.
Yeah, I think it's a really fascinating thing, because I think everyone thought till very, very recently, companies like McDonald's or Burger King, or for that matter, a place like Walmart, were basically impregnable. You know, the obstacles were so great towards organizing workers that almost no one even tried, you know. And in some ways that's still the case. If you're talking about a traditional union organization, you know, it's hard to conceive right now how that could happen in a place like McDonald's. But what's interesting is people are just acting without worrying about all that, you know. and you know, they're having one-day strikes, having picket lines, they're having some clever publicity. And it's put this issue of low-wage work on the table, you know, along with Occupy Wall Street and other things. And you know, what the end game is a little unclear. You know, it's added to the pressure to raise the minimum wage, which is an alternative solution to unionization. You know, and you see it, for example, in Seattle now, where they have a $15 you know, an hour, and pressure in New York State, and many states are raising it. I think some of the sponsors, you know, let's be frank, I mean, some of this is being funded by unions, you know, through kind of front groups, to use an old-fashioned term. You know,
I think it's kind of smart on the part of the unions.
Absolutely.
The unions have been in trouble, so much trouble.
Absolutely, and I think they don't quite know themselves how this is going to end up. But lots of funny things are happening. The NLRB, for example, recently decided that McDonald's was a joint employer with its franchise owners. Now, if this actually sticks up, this decision, it would have profound effects on not just labor relations, but actually, you know, the whole model of the fast food industry. I'm a little skeptical that it's going to stand in the courts. We'll see. It's going to take a couple of years till we find out. But that's again, the kind of thing that I don't think any of us imagined, even just a couple of years ago, we'd see. So there are lots of little signs, and you know, whether they'll become a critical mass, I don't know yet, but something seems to be going on.
But explain why that's important. If McDonald's as a whole, if the McDonald's Corporation is seen as responsible for, say, wages, working conditions, that sort of thing, why would that be such a big deal?
Well, if you
As
have,
opposed to
right.
the individual
Right.
franchises where you go in and ask for a raise
Yeah.
and they tell you get out of here.
Exactly. If you have thousands of separate employers, which is now the way it's defined, having a regional or a national campaign becomes so logistically difficult. And even if you did get, some sort of vote and you won in one franchise, they might just close up, or it'd be an anomaly. But if the national corporation that controls the brand, is now seen as a co-employer, it then becomes responsible for wage rates and hours and so forth, and it's susceptible to pressure of all kinds. It could be a formal NLRB type of union vote. I think we're a long way from there, but these are companies that don't want to look bad.
Right.
So they're consumer product companies, and therefore if you can pressure a McDonald's by saying, look, you're going to be seen as a bad guy. People are going to go down the street. They're going to go to the franchise owners. Okay, let's change. We saw this with Starbucks just a couple of weeks ago. It took one article in the New York Times,
Yep.
which exposed the way scheduling created havoc in the lives of Starbucks employees, for the company, I think much to their credit, to step up and say, we're going to change the way we're going to do this. We're going to have more dependable scheduling. People are going to know more in advance. So I think it demonstrates how vulnerable consumer companies are compared to maybe some companies that are selling to other businesses that we don't even know the names of those places.
Now, this scheduling that you mentioned is a big deal because not only do these workers have basically a lousy income, they're working for low wages, but they're not getting 40 hours a week most of the time. But they're not even on a regular schedule.
Right.
They're not. The bosses don't say, "Well, you're going to work Monday,
Right.
Wednesday, and Friday
Right.
of this week." Explain what's been going on.
Yeah, I mean, what I think is happening is that very sophisticated computer programs are now being used by all these companies to shave off every fraction of labor costs that they can. And when they do that, is they want to right-size the workforce. If you have a certain amount of business, you have 8 employees. If you have a certain amount, you have 9 employees. Well, you think you might have 9 employees worth of business, and you tell 9 people 2 days ahead of time to show up. You only have 8, people's worth of business, and the 9th person shows up. They can be told, not just given a short day's work, they can be told, go home.
Go home.
We don't need you. There's nothing illegal about that in most of the United States. You may give up hours of your time. One of the first things that unions in many industries did was demand a minimum pay. If you're called to report to work, you have to be paid at least 4 hours pay, or 2 hours pay, or 3 hours pay. And then, of course, having a regular schedule, particularly for people with children. This is a nightmare. Not knowing until a couple days in advance, having it constantly be adjusted, night shift, day shift. You can't have a life. It creates havoc. And you can't go to school. How can you take night classes if every 3rd week they suddenly tell you have to work at night? So I think one of the things that retail workers are looking for is not just higher pay, although they certainly want that, but some sort of stability that would enable them to improve themselves, as well as just get through each week. And that's something I think that it's a reasonable demand. I think companies can do it, and Starbucks is an interesting case where they seem to be able to pretty quickly change the way they do things.
All of these problems, the low wages, the contingent work, the irregular schedules, lack of benefits, all of them are a result to some extent of the fact that the workers are not organized, whether they're in a union or whatever, they're not organized. Big business is always well organized. So in the absence of the traditional labor unions, can you imagine reasonable ways for workers to be organized in some ways? Now, I know we have some of these community groups and the sort of restaurant workers that you've been talking about, maybe the Taxi Workers Alliance. But talk about a little bit about the need for workers to be organized in order to get anywhere.
Yeah. Well, I think you're absolutely right. Companies, they see their responsibility as maximizing profits, and they're not going to give in unless they're forced to. Sometimes market forces force them to. You can't hire workers, but it's going to take pressure, and on the political as well as the individual employer front. So I think there have been lots of efforts at alternative models, and some of them I think have been somewhat successful. So-called worker centers, which are not engaged in collective bargaining, but help workers deal with individual problems, grievances. You see a lot of this in the restaurant industry where workers are not given the tips or the overtime. Worker centers may go to court, win a settlement, advocate for new laws. Sometimes you see sort of community based or ethnic-based advocacy groups, that may even cut across industries. Is kind of another model that you see. And then these kind of targeted campaigns, for sick leave law or for a higher minimum wage. And we've seen a fair amount of success with that as well. So I think these are all interesting, encouraging signs. Can they scale up? Because after all, when you're dealing with a Walmart, your community group is a little, it's shooting a pop gun, frankly.
A pop gun against a behemoth.
Exactly. So, the question is, how do you scale up? And it's more of an issue in some industries than others, depending upon how it's structured. And how do you convert that politically, too? And I think we're seeing immense debates about that right now, particularly here in New York State, where the Working Families Party, which has been a pretty successful voice for workers, has been very split this year about supporting politicians who have made specific deals but not really supported a general progressive vision versus a more long-term strategy, run your own candidates, try to build an institution, but you may be sacrificing some real and actually important short-term gains. So these are tough issues.
One of the things that I've never really been able to understand, almost everyone you talk to will have the attitude in the United States that businesses, corporations have a right to earn a profit. That's the reason they're there. That's the point. They don't have a similar acceptance of the idea that workers have a right to a decent wage. Do you have an idea of why there's this dichotomy?
Well, that's a very interesting question. There are two parts to it. First of all, why these corporations have these rights? Because they also have privileges, limited liability and other things. And they have to be chartered by states. And originally corporations, you couldn't just say I want a corporate charter. You had to justify it with a public good. And today the idea of somehow rethinking the idea of giving corporations, free rein in terms of charters, and giving them personhood, which is what this is.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So
another show.
Yeah, right. That's completely off the table, and it should be put back on the table. We should be talking about, well, what are you going to do in return for that?
Right.
That right. In terms of workers' rights, I think we have different notions of freedom, in the United States. And often our notion of freedom has been freedom of a kind of liberty from government, freedom from government interfering with us. I think starting in the 20th century, we added a different kind of notion of freedom, which included the kinds of things that people like Roosevelt were talking about: freedom from want, right to a job, right to a decent health care. And there was a moment in the mid-20th century where I think there was a lot of support for that, and I think that's declined pretty radically. And some of it is a general hostility to government for other reasons. Some of it is a sense that we can't compete internationally if we provide these benefits, which I think is wrong, but nonetheless, it's often been made. And frankly, I think the defenders of the idea of a expansive state as a source of liberty, have not done a very good job. In a few areas like civil rights, I think it was a very well articulated area. But in the social realm of supporting education, healthcare, income security, that case has not been well made.
Well, this has been wonderful. We've run out of time. I hope you'll come back. There are so many issues for us to pursue. My guest has been Professor Joshua Freeman. Thank you so much. We'll be back in a moment with a final word. My former colleague at the New York Times, Stephen Greenhouse, recently wrote a harrowing front-page story about children working dangerous 12-hour shifts in the tobacco fields of North Carolina. In an effort to avoid being sickened by the nicotine-tinged dew and other moisture dripping from the tobacco leaves, Some of the youngsters drape themselves in black plastic garbage bags while they work. The heat, the humidity, the long hours, and the exposure to the noxious plants often leave these young workers so ill they have difficulty breathing. How can this be legal? Greenhouse tells us that Brazil, India, and other countries that produce tobacco have banned the employment of youngsters under 16 years of age because the work is so hazardous. But when the Obama administration tried to impose such a ban in the United States, farm groups and Republican lawmakers were outraged and fought back furiously. The administration withdrew its proposal and promised not to seek a ban, quote, for the remainder of the Obama administration. What in the world is wrong with us? Do we really not care about this kind of egregious mistreatment of children in America? I hope that's not true. That's all for now. See you next time.